Buenos días, vamos a dar inicio a nuestro evento. Good morning, we are going to start our event. And first of all, we are giving just some instructions on how to use the interpretation channel. At the bottom, you'll see an interpretation icon with a globe. There, you can choose the language in which you want to hear the event. Para quienes acaban de unirse, muy buenos días. Vamos a iniciar nuestro evento. En la parte inferior ustedes encuentran un icono que dice interpretación, tiene un globo. Allí ustedes pueden escuchar, seleccionar el canal en que quieren escuchar el evento. Pueden escucharlo en español, en inglés o en el idioma en que se va a transmitir original. Entonces, por favor, les pedimos que escojan el icono en el cual van a escuchar el evento. So, good morning again. I hope you have already chosen the language in which you want to hear the event today. Please let us know if you have any question. There is the IT people in our event. You could see them by the name Soporte Faciso. They can help you if you have any issue with the interpretation. And I'm just going to ask Melanie Judge, my colleague, to start the event today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Fernando. Hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well in the language of your choice. It's 4:05 where I am, but good morning, good evening, greetings to everyone from around the world, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Melanie Judge. I'm from the law faculty at the University of Cape Town, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this launch of the special issue of Revista de Estudios Sociales on the topic of queer peace building. Today, we're going to briefly introduce you to the special issue, which can be accessed freely online, and we will post the link if you haven't got it yet to the special issue. Don't read it while we're here together, but read it hopefully once your interest has been piqued as a result of today's discussion. We will then move into a moderated conversation with a panel of activists and scholars on the topic of queer peace building, and our fabulous conversationalists will be introduced to you in a few minutes. After that, there'll be an opportunity for you to post questions in the chat box for the editors and the speakers to engage with at the end of the conversation. But before we jump into the exciting stuff, on behalf of the editors of the special issue, I want to extend our deepest thanks to the Faculty of Social Sciences at Universidad de los Andes for hosting today's event, and particularly to the technical team that are making the machines work for us. We are also very grateful to the journal, Revista de Estudios Sociales, for welcoming with opening arms the idea of a special issue on queer peace and queer peace building. And finally, our thanks go to UNDP's We Belong Africa program for sponsoring the interpretation of today's event. So to kick off, just a quick reflection that I think many of us are aware that there's a lot of very necessary attention that's given worldwide to how LGBTI people experience and struggle against conflict and against violence. There is, however, less attention given to how LGBTI communities and movements conceive of and contribute to peace building and to the shaping of post-conflict societies. And so today, we want to shine a light on the concept of queer peace building, what it means, what challenges it brings, and very importantly, how it advances rights, justice, and the thinking and the doing of peace itself. So against this backdrop, I'm now going to hand over to the lead editor of the special issue, Dr. Fernando Serrano Amaya. Fernando is assistant professor at the Department of Languages and Culture at UniAndes, and he will share how the idea for the special issue came about and what it hopes to to offer. So welcome again. Thanks for being here. And over to you, Fernando.
Gracias, Melanie. Thank you, Melanie. This is kind of a challenge, this exchange between languages, but it's also part of the task that we want in this event. Now I'm going to speak in Spanish because it's my original language, and we want also to stress the importance of this intercultural and interlanguages task. Buenos días. De nuevo, entonces, voy a hablar en español porque es mi lengua original y quiero que pues mostremos en este evento el reto que ha sido hacer este número especial entre lenguas, entre culturas, entre diferentes experiencias. Esta idea empezó hace ya casi 4 años, cuando quisimos conectar experiencias investigativas no solamente de diferentes disciplinas, sino también de diferentes países y de diferentes abordajes al tema de paz y a lo que han sido los estudios de género, sexualidad y disidencias sexuales. Quisimos con esta idea documentar todas las innovaciones y desarrollos que colectivos y activismos LGBT en el mundo han hecho al respecto. Y quisimos que este número especial fuera sobre todo un espacio para conectar experiencias que han estado de cierta manera dispersas, desarticuladas y que no han encontrado un foro público de encuentro. En ese sentido, este número especial lo pensamos como un foro público para crear diálogos entre el norte y el sur y entre el sur en su diversidad. Hicimos una convocatoria en el año 2021 a la cual recibimos 29 manifestaciones de interés de una gran variedad de temas que respondieron a nuestra pregunta de qué significa la construcción de paz queer. De estas 29 ideas iniciales, había una variedad de abordajes a lo que significa este tema, que incluían, por ejemplo, asuntos como los derechos de personas LGBTQ en el mundo, formas en que han sido afectadas por los conflictos, sus activismos y una gran variedad de temas. Esto hizo evidente que la construcción de paz queer es todavía un concepto en elaboración y por eso abordamos el hacer este número especial como un gran reto. Un reto que significaba darle contenido a un tema que se iba construyendo a medida que se iba nombrando. En ese sentido, los artículos que escogimos para este número especial fueron también el resultado de un diálogo en construcción entre autores y autoras y el equipo editorial. De ese diálogo en el cual, en la construcción misma del término, le fuimos dando contenido, resultaron los artículos que escogimos para este número especial, que podemos agruparlos en 3 ideas principales. Tenemos artículos que buscan reconocer y documentar la diversidad de participación de personas queer y organizaciones queer en la construcción de paz. Por ejemplo, la contribución de Miyerlandi Cabanzo y Rebeca Guindele explora los límites y posibilidades de la participación de personas y colectivos queer en la construcción de paz en Colombia. La contribución de Giancarlo Cornejo, por ejemplo, defiende la importancia de las coaliciones políticas travesti y queer en América Latina para darle un contenido a lo que significa la construcción de paz queer. Tenemos otras contribuciones que abordan el tema desde un cuestionamiento a la inclusión mecánica y nominal de las experiencias de colectivos y activismos queer al respecto. Así, por ejemplo, el artículo de Catherine Galás, Fernanda Stang y Antonia Lara discute los problemas de la noción de diversidad con la cual comúnmente se incluyen estos temas en diferentes discusiones públicas. Una idea que fue muy importante en la construcción del consenso postdictorial en el Chile de la dictadura. El trabajo de Gabriela Pineiro, por ejemplo, hace el mismo cuestionamiento al discutir cómo aparecen los temas queer en el Plan de Acción Nacional de Sudáfrica y cómo allí se hace una lectura específica a las necesidades de mujeres y personas queer desde una idea de paz y seguridad. El tercer grupo de artículos que tenemos en el número especial amplían los abordajes a la idea de lo que significa una paz queer desde diferentes ángulos. Por ejemplo, la contribución de Lan Méndez y de Luis Fernando Vilan nos invita a pensar la construcción de paz como una experiencia estética, contrastando con las ideas más comunes que abordan la construcción de paz desde una mirada de paz liberal. La contribución de Diana Paola Garcés discute, por ejemplo, cómo se ha tratado la victimización de personas LGBT en contextos legales en el caso colombiano. Con esta breve introducción, queremos entonces invitarles a que lean el número especial, a que lo usen como material de trabajo y a que hagan de este básicamente una contribución al desarrollo de este nuevo campo de discusión. Quiero de nuevo reiterar mi agradecimiento no solamente a la revista por haber acogido esta idea, a quienes están el día de hoy en este evento, y de manera especial quiero agradecerle a mis colegas que se unieron en este proyecto, a Melanie Josh, a Jamie Hagen y Samuel Rithold, quienes aceptaron esta invitación hace ya prácticamente 4 años para sumarse en esta tarea y que todo el tiempo han manifestado un compromiso constante para sacar el proyecto que presentamos el día de hoy. Con esto entonces, vuelvo a darle ya la palabra a mi colega Melanie para que nos introduzca a Jamie y a las personas que van a hacer el panel el día de hoy. Muchas gracias.
Over to you, Jamie.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So thank you so much for setting us up to talk about this special issue, which I'm so thrilled. We had such a wonderful group of contributors participate in this special issue. I'm a lecturer in international relations at Queen's University Belfast, and I co-direct the Center for Gender and Politics. And it's been really meaningful to be part of these conversations, not just in terms of engaging with what's happening on the ground in Colombia, but also as an instructor who's engaged in teaching international relations and peace and conflict studies. So I also want to invite people when they're speaking, and I'm saying this to myself at the same time, to remember we have interpretation. So slow down a little bit. And I'm actually slowing down as I say this. And now I'd like to introduce the 3 fantastic speakers that we have to engage with us about the special issue today and how it relates to the work that they're doing. So we have Irene Chen, who is an independent consultant and senior advisor on global LGBTIQ refugee policy, having previously worked with UNDP, UNHCR, and the UN Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. She currently advises international human rights foundations on strategic grant making for queer and trans displaced people worldwide. Our second speaker is Pasha Buena Hansen, who is an associate professor of women and gender studies and political science and international relations at the University of Delaware in the USA. She places her research and teaching at the service of social justice. And our third speaker is Mauricio Albarracin, who is the subdirector of the LGBT program at Human Rights Watch. He's a lawyer and philosopher at the Universidad Industrial de Santander and has a doctorate in law from the Universidad de los Andes. So we have the privilege of hearing from the 3 of you today and reflecting on this special issue, but really how it relates to the work that you're doing, because we were very mindful of wanting to have this be relevant to people who are doing the work of queer peace building. So I would really like to invite all 3 of you to reflect on what queer peace building is and how this construction of this idea of a queer peace relates to the work that you're engaged in. And so I wonder if I can begin with Mauricio to introduce the work that you're doing and how that relates to some of the things that we've been bringing to the fore in this special issue.
Ok, bueno, buenos días, muchas gracias por la invitación y por para comentar el lanzamiento de esta revista. Lo primero que quisiera decir es felicitaciones por organizar este número. Yo creo que el número tiene varios gestos y adicionalmente es el resultado del trabajo de investigación por años de las personas que editaron el volumen, y particularmente quisiera señalar dos para comenzar, y es, como lo señalan en el capítulo introductorio, la intersección de campos, y adicionalmente algo que mencionaba José Fernando, esta idea de conectar experiencias. Es muy interesante que el lugar de articulación sea Colombia, y sea desde Colombia y en Colombia que se ocurra esta articulación de investigadoras, investigadores sobre un tema. Bien, entonces yo quisiera comenzar rápidamente, en el tiempo que tengo, con un hecho que me parece muy significativo para este tema, y fue la reunión que se llama ARRIA, que realmente es una reunión que hace el Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas con la sociedad civil la semana pasada en la ciudad de Nueva York. Y en esa reunión, María Susana Peralta, que es coordinadora de paz de Colombia Diversa, una organización, perdón la redundancia, colombiana, señaló 4 cosas que a mí me parecen muy interesantes para señalar respecto a la construcción de paz queer, o la construcción de la paz desde este tipo de situaciones. Y son 2 ideas y 2 prácticas. Una idea que ella planteaba es que una sociedad que discrimina no está en paz, un poco simplificando su argumento. Y el segundo, o la segunda idea, que yo creo que está en el centro de muchas de estas discusiones, es que la discriminación es útil en la guerra o en los conflictos armados. Estas son las 2 ideas que ella presentó, y 2 prácticas que me parecieron muy interesantes, incluso a la luz del Consejo de Seguridad. Ella decía en la reunión que los asuntos de género y sexualidad están en el corazón de los asuntos propios del Consejo de Seguridad, lo cual es muy desafiante si uno considera los asuntos que discute el Consejo de Seguridad cotidianamente. Y las 2 prácticas que ella señalaba era, uno, el rol de los movimientos sociales produciendo esta articulación, y la segunda, el rol de las instituciones y las recomendaciones a las instituciones a partir de ese trabajo. Y con ese hecho, y un poco dialogando con, un poco inspirado por las ideas que están en el número, en el capítulo introductorio, quisiera señalar 5 cosas más específicas sobre qué significaría la construcción de paz queer. El número tiene un concepto muy interesante que se desarrolla a lo largo de su lectura, y es esta dimensión multivocal, pero también una dimensión multisituada, es decir, quién produce este conocimiento, para quién, por quién y dónde circula, es decir, una desarticulación de centros de producción de conocimiento y de recepción del conocimiento. Yo creo que quienes hemos trabajado en Colombia hemos tenido esta sensación de que aparecen estudiantes a hacernos entrevistas sobre qué pasó en Colombia, y estudiantes normalmente de universidades del norte, digamos, recogen este conocimiento, producen este conocimiento, pero aquí hay una pregunta, y esto lo he conversado mucho con José Fernando, es ¿cuál es el sujeto de producción, el sujeto de validación de ese conocimiento, y cómo a partir en esos procesos desaparecen, por ejemplo, los movimientos sociales o los actores institucionales que producen ese conocimiento? Que sin esos actores sería imposible entender esa historia. Entonces, este es mi primer punto, y voy a decir los otros 4 en un minuto. El otro es la relación entre teoría y práctica, o yo diría más entre práctica y teoría, porque realmente lo que ocurre en este campo es que la práctica ha sido una fuente de producción de conocimiento por aparte de esos actores, y sin lugar a dudas, y creo que ese tipo de situaciones no han sido lo suficientemente valoradas. Hay unos conceptos que tiene muy interesante integrados esta discusión, y es el de paz, seguridad, guerra, violencia, prejuicio, y esa discusión que me parece que señala muy bien la introducción, y es sobre la falta de linealidad de esos conceptos, la aparente linealidad y separación entre guerra y paz, violencia y prejuicio, etcétera. Yo creo que ese es un tema súper interesante. Los colombianos, o les colombianos, vivimos atrapados en esta situación todos los días. Entonces, un día el ELN mata a 9 soldados que estaban durmiendo, y eso pasa ayer. Entonces, también para nosotros la guerra y la paz es una situación como de permanente vivencia. También hay un asunto muy interesante que llaman en la introducción, y es el prejuicio como el prejuicio en tiempos de paz y en tiempos de guerra, en un trabajo que hizo María Daniela Díaz muy interesante sobre los órdenes del prejuicio. Y esa dimensión que se señala en la introducción sobre lo que se llama un poco la paz neoliberal. Yo lo pensaría más como la paz como esa utilidad de parar las hostilidades, que es tan importante en nuestro discurso, y esa idea de una paz transformadora o esperanzadora de que a partir de la paz podemos construir un mundo mejor. Y todo eso para decir que adicionalmente en el caso colombiano y particularmente en este tema, yo veo que los temas LGBT o los temas queer también parten o tienen un proceso traumático. La derrota del plebiscito es un asunto que marca mucho esta historia y ese proceso traumático pues está también en el centro de la construcción de ese proceso. Entonces, y básicamente voy a decir dos cosas rápidamente. Estoy de acuerdo y particularmente con ese uso de este concepto para la documentación. La documentación es muy poca, es necesaria y la documentación de todo tipo de hechos. En el Consejo de Seguridad varios países señalaban la falta de datos desagregados. Este es un problema en este campo. Y finalmente, sobre el cuestionamiento teórico y potencial transformador, voy a decir algo muy breve. Estoy de acuerdo con el tipo de preguntas que plantea esta perspectiva. Sin embargo, yo diría que tal vez el reto más importante es cómo las preguntas teóricas llegan a los que tienen que operar esto en la práctica. Porque quienes tienen que operar esto en la práctica no tienen problemas teóricos sobre marcos teóricos, sino tienen problemas prácticos de cómo documentar este tipo de violencia u otro frente a una víctima en un sistema específico de reparación o de imputación criminal. Entonces, yo dejaría por ahí mis comentarios iniciales. Gracias.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those insights, and we'll be able to talk about them a little bit more. And maybe I'll hand over to Pasha to speak to the same questions about how you're thinking about queer peace in relation to the work that you're doing, and what a special issue like this means in terms of engaging in existing scholarship and maybe pushing that in new directions.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this space. And I just want to start by congratulating Samuel Ritholz, Jose Fernando Serrano Amaya, Jamie J. Hagan, and Melanie Judge for this extremely exciting collection and really thoughtful introduction to what Fernando highlighted as a dialogue under construction that's intercultural, multilingual, interdisciplinary, and multi-situated, thinking carefully about the North-South and the South-South components, and what does it, how does knowledge get produced within these asymmetrical power relationships? So all of this is just super exciting to me. My work engages more sort of punctually with transitional justice. And one of the things that I've been coming to over the last year or so that I feel that this contribution really helps to elaborate further, and we can continue to elaborate this, is how the entry point that you all are proposing really broadens the conception of what how can we rethink peace and justice together out that trespasses and goes beyond how peace building and transitional justice and security and even counterterrorism and studies of forced displacement and refugee and asylum status, like how those get sort of siloed out in theory and in practice. So I feel like one of the contributions that's exciting is how can we take this sort of queer peace building entry point to draw out and pull together how experiences and practices and interventions and demands cross-cut a lot of those different both spaces of intervention and theory building. So that's just one contribution I think is super exciting, and it makes sense given the fact that liberal peace building is under this very intense interrogation, right? As you could say, transitional justice too. And we have like this incredible sort of militarization of processes and of course this sort of growing counterterrorism architecture at the international level. So these, and you know, we can go on about global authoritarianism and so forth. So I feel like this is a very helpful frame to kind of rethink the parameters of our interventions. And I just want to kind of even offer a little bit of a teaser of the conceptualization that's offered in the intro of 4 dimensions. And I found these 4 dimensions very helpful, sort of as a way that I even teaching can, you know, I can see teaching this and having this be very helpful for students who are trying to wrap their minds around this material. And the focusing on the histories of queer activists and activism. And I kind of think of this as sort of activist protagonism, and that activist knowledge production is at the center of this, and how it was already mentioned, how that gets extracted and how that gets extracted from the contextual collective source of knowledge production of activist groups, and it gets labeled and cited as a production from a particular individual academic. So like problematizing and re-anchoring the knowledge production in the collective activist protagonist praxis, to me seems like, you know, super critical. Connecting feminist and queer alliances, I'm on board with that 100%. Reconceptualizing peace and insecurity and security through a queer epistemic critique. I love that. And then I want to sort of pause and spend a little bit more time, if I have 1 minute, on the 4th dimension, which is the transformative potential of queer inclusion in peace building efforts. And for me, that transformative potential is really where I would find my work really like situated, and thinking about this transformative potential as absolutely linked in with the transformative potential of abolitionist political projects, and also the idea of security based on nurturing sustainable bio-territorial and ecological systems. So, you know, kind of thinking more broadly about like, how can we connect, as Fernando mentioned earlier, sort of these coalitional frames of different pieces of struggle to be able to support this political imaginary of how we collectively want to live and build this world in peace.
Thank you so much for that. And now, Irene, could you also reflect from the position of your experience, your reflections on what queer peace building can mean for rethinking some of these dimensions of security, and why this is important, and maybe how you've encountered that as well in terms of what we've, as Pasha has articulated with some of these dimensions that we're trying to draw out in this special issue.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Can everybody hear me? Because I've been having some tech. Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for inviting me to be here today with you. It's very humbling for me, and it's a real honor. I want to thank the organizers of this very timely panel and the authors of the special issue for including my voice, which is coming from obviously outside Latin America region, and in some ways from outside the peace building practice per se. I have worked in that field before, but it was a while back. And so I want to say that Latin America is a region which in many ways is a global forerunner in demonstrating how to sensitively and respectfully amplify the voices and rights of LGBTQI plus people who have survived violent conflict. I know that things are far from perfect, but this part of the world is quite a standard setter in many ways. And I would just like to compliment what Mauricio and Pasha have already shared from the perspective of someone who's worked as a practitioner in each of these professional silos, so to speak, of international humanitarian protection, development assistance, and peace building. And I would like to pick up on something Mauricio mentioned earlier when he referred to the UN Security Council ARIA conversation that took place about 2 weeks ago. which was examining how to uphold the human rights of LGBTI people through the work of the UN Security Council, which is, of course, very focused in some ways on conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and peace building. And he referred to something that Maria Susana Peralta from Colombia Diversa mentioned, which is that 21st century queer intersectional feminist peace building requires us to recognize that enforced social and structural invisibility is in and of itself a form of persecution. So what this means for me is that often what we propose as solutions for armed conflict often still contains the same toxicity that poisons our societies, and that, if left unaddressed, will eventually lead to armed conflicts breaking out again. So for me, queer peace building takes at its starting point this understanding that the outbreak of violent conflict is simply the most visible expression of much more latent, deep-rooted, long-standing, and invisible forms of intersecting structural discrimination and violence, which are often reinforced and intensified by actors from both state and outside of the government, which have become normalized. Inevitably, they will compel people to flee for their lives, including LGBTIQ+ people. This has been highlighted by the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity in a report that he shared with the UN General Assembly last autumn, in which some of you have also contributed, and which he notes that people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics are often already among the most stigmatized, marginalized, and scapegoated social outsiders long before decision makers recognize that they, or I could say we, exist. And yet at the same time, which is something very eloquently pointed out in the special issue, queer people are often on the forefront of movements to defend human rights and to create visionary ways of shaping a sustainable peace. So something I've noticed in my work is that there is improvement happening in the professional spheres of humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and peace building, but it's very slow moving. And a lot of times LGBTIQ+ people remain very invisible during these formal processes of humanitarian aid delivery, refugee protection response, conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and peace building. And sometimes this results in the creation of a separate humanitarian response network and or a separate peace building process, which may operate kind of in parallel to what's going on in the mainstream structures. And I'm noting that this is something that is occurring in Ukraine right now, for example, also in parts of South Asia. And I appreciate, Melanie, you're based in South Africa, right? And having worked with a UNDP, I would say that UNDP has made some very innovative steps to try to integrate its own development assistance work with a much more human rights-based focus. And in a way, it might be a little bit more ahead of the curve than some international organizations in the humanitarian community. Having said this, I will say that, you know, the UN Development Program and the UN Department of Peacekeeping and Political and Peacebuilding Affairs do work together to provide peace and development technical assistance in many parts of the world. And I have noted that in Kenya and Tunisia, their peace and development advisors are actually actively working to highlight the situation of LGBTQI+ people in those particular contexts. Yet at the same time, queer and trans people of all ages exist in every nationality, ethnicity, faith background, level of health, education, and income. They can be part of armed movements. They can be part of state parties to conflict, and they are often civilians. So treating LGBTIQ plus people in a separate but equal manner in the period before the eruption of hostilities or the cessation of hostilities doesn't help to build strong foundations for upholding universal human rights. So I would say that we need to go beyond the cursory inclusion of LGBTIQ plus people in conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and post-conflict reconciliation and reconstruction. It's a very important step, but in and of itself, it is the beginning. I would second what Maurizio and Pasha have mentioned, which is that it's important to work together in a whole of society way. So that means the peace building silo, and the humanitarian sector, with which I'm a little bit more involved because I'm concerned with refugees and displaced people. And then the development sector, we need to cooperate and work together to empower LGBTIQ plus people. I've thought about three things. First is to create enabling conditions to make it visible the experiences, strengths, and challenges that queer and trans people go through in any armed conflict, and then to understand how these challenges relate to deeper structural inequalities that drive conflict for everyone in the first place. Secondly, it's important to fully integrate LGBTIQ plus people into formal and informal decision-making structures and processes at all levels of society, from the community level all the way up to the national level or the regional or even the global level. Thirdly, by queering organizational cultures, policies, and practices of the key duty-bearing institutions and actors who have the obligation to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the human rights of queer people. That means identifying and supporting the allies and champions in these international organizations, in government, even among non-state armed actors, but certainly in academia, because you are often the thought leaders on these new ways of envisioning how we can live more peacefully and justly together, and certainly in civil society. I'm thinking in particular of faith actors who work with the reintegration of people who have been forcibly displaced, and in transitional justice, healing, and reconciliation. I want to just stop and ask Jamie, how much time do I have left?
Well, I think where you've just ended will be good to segue into the next round of questions. And so, because
Okay.
you gave like very specific ideas about what queer peace building looks like, but I think now, and also I want to encourage people to put questions into our chat box, because we will open up to Q&A after this round. But Mauricio, can you give even more concrete examples of what this looks like, or how you're thinking about queer peace building in the everyday in your work, and maybe moving away? Because one of the things that we wanted to do with this, with an introduction, was really looking at theory to praxis, right? Like, we're really wanting to, this is not a theoretical experience for the people we're working with and the people we're in community with, right? So how do we then, and when we find people who are interested and newer to the topic, often, certainly in queering women, peace and security work, I'm of course asked, well, what do you mean? What does that look like? And so I wonder if you could reflect a bit on, it was really helpful to hear what's happening at the Security Council, but how do we think about that at different scales in ways that maybe have been given less attention? Because that was something that we were wanting to think about this across the different spaces where we see peace building, and where feminist peace builders have talked about in the everyday. So Could you reflect on that a little bit based on your experience, and based on the fantastic contributions from the three of you so far?
Ok, quisiera decir dos cosas, una más, digamos, teórica y una más práctica. Yo creo que cuando uno habla de estos temas hay como, y perdón la simplificación, como tres gestos. El gesto identitario es ¿dónde están los LGBT? Sí, como este gesto muy activista cuando uno ve cierta política y no está incluido. Y yo creo que la forma en que el Estado contesta, y digamos si se quiere usar un término que está en la introducción, una forma liberal o neoliberal es, ok, pongámoslos, ¿sí? En una referencia que es difícil de traducir, que es la canción de los prisioneros, el baile de los que sobran. Pónganlo allá en donde son los que sobran. Entonces están, que adicionalmente es más dramático y crítico porque en los que sobran están las mujeres. Sí, la forma en que se construye usualmente esta política es la seguridad, entonces está acá y un cajoncito para todos los demás grupos. Que yo creo que es algo que, aunque se entiende por qué ocurre así, digamos, es algo que debemos criticar en la medida en que es una manera en que mantiene la estructura de la seguridad y la paz como un tema principal y los otros como temas subsidiarios. Y luego está el gesto conservador que tiene como dos caras, que Rusia, Ghana y China lo pusieron en el Consejo de Seguridad muy claramente, esto es un asunto de derechos humanos, este no es un asunto de seguridad. Sí, que es una forma de decir, y bueno, fue sorprendente que incluso Rusia dijo algo a favor de los derechos de las personas LGBT para decir, esto es un asunto que no concierne al Consejo de Seguridad. Y otro gesto conservador es la demonización y uso de personas LGBT. Entonces, es como tres gestos muy simplificados. Yo creo que lo que propone esta forma de ver la construcción de paz es romper con esta idea de separación temática a partir de nuevas alianzas, de preguntas conceptuales interesantes. Entonces, yo creo que ese es como un gesto muy importante para poder proponer prácticas. Y yo creo que en las cosas prácticas me parece que ya mis colegas han propuesto algunas y también las que propuso Colombia Diversa en el Consejo de Seguridad, pero yo creo que un tema, y también por la propia experiencia del caso colombiano, es uno, la participación es crítica en todas las fases del proceso, participar antes, durante y después. Yo creo que lo que hacía que el movimiento LGBTI colombiano estuviera, digamos, presto, listo y convocado era su tradición de trabajar temas de paz previamente. Entonces la participación es crítica, pero requiere un movimiento que esté muy conectado. Una cosa que está ocurriendo en Colombia que es muy importante es la apertura de un caso, porque a partir de un caso en la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz podemos ver esto en la práctica, qué dimensiones metodológicas, prácticas, teóricas, qué dificultades, qué tensiones entre activistas, científicos sociales y tomadores de decisión existen. Entonces, tener un caso abierto es no solamente único en el mundo, sino también una gran ventaja, tanto analítica, práctica y política. Y yo diría que una tercera cosa que me parece práctica, muy importante, y voy a insistir en eso, es el punto de la documentación. Y en esto voy a hacer una cosa, o decir algo muy, o sea, sin hechos, un poco los abogados vivimos en esta tensión, pues hay una parte de un grupo de juristas, pues sin hechos, dame los hechos y te daré el derecho, un poco sin hechos, sin casos, sin construcción de historias, es muy difícil es muy difícil aterrizar todo ese concepto en la práctica y hay mucha, pues también a veces mucha deformación teórica sobre situaciones de las cuales no tenemos información. Entonces yo dejaría por ahí.
Thank you. Thank you for those reflections and for those really important points about what your experience has been in terms of how to move queer peace building forward. Pasha, do you want to pick up on any of that and elaborate on, again, thinking about practice, thinking about some of the points that Irene made about these different levels of where we can see LGBTQ people, how we can think about actually queering rather than maybe having the liberal addition approach?
Muchas gracias por la pregunta y quisiera complementar un poco lo que acaba de compartir Mauricio y en vez como que cambiar un poco la óptica cara hacia la sociedad civil o hacia la población en general, ¿no? Porque hay también una paz, un proceso de paz desde activistas, activistas, colectivos, ¿no? Que están trabajando duramente en cambiar la dinámica sociocultural que es complementaria al proceso cara al Estado, ¿no? Entonces, para mis comentarios en esta ronda, quisiera tomar un hilo que está aquí en este revista, es este conjunto de ensayos, que es entender la paz como un proceso dinámico y que genera un proceso dinámico de paz, que la paz no es una cosa estática, o sea, es un proceso dinámico y que se genera en colectivo, ¿no? Y que la producción artística, estética, es clave en abrir el imaginario de la población en general, ¿no? Y tenemos muchos ejemplos extremadamente interesantes en Colombia, y también si miramos otros contextos, también podemos hablar de, por ejemplo, el contexto peruano, y quiero ahora tomar el artículo que se llama Las otras memorias de Gio Infante, por ejemplo, y la manera en que Gio Infante escribe, ¿no? Y eso como una práctica creativa, ¿no? Una práctica que interpela al lector. Y me encanta este artículo también porque he estudiado o me pertenece mucho este caso de Perú, y he conocido a Gio Infante. Fue una persona muy inspirador, y su forma de escribir y identificar sin ningún no suavizar nunca la sociedad autoritaria que es el Perú, ¿no? Y entender que esa forma de descalificar al otro, esa forma que identifica Gio Infante, se ve ahorita mismo en el terruqueo, ¿no? Que es una práctica ahorita muy viva en Perú, de descalificar a cualquier persona que está protestando, que quiere cambiar la situación de violencia política y represión militar en el Perú. O sea, creo que ahorita este artículo nos ayuda y nos da claves para comprender lo que está pasando en el Perú ahorita en este tiempo, y la intervención que hace en utilizar una forma de hacer que el lector se acerca mucho a su experiencia propia, ¿no? De cerrar una brecha social a través de la forma de escribir, y que eso es una práctica cultural artística, ¿no? Eso me parece increíble, y me parece importante también destacar el trabajo de Lan Méndez de Barrios y Luis Fernando Huilán sobre la paz como una práctica emancipatoria y estética, y la paz como un espacio de producción artística que activa la capacidad de un imaginario radical. Entonces, esos son unos elementos que me parecen muy importantes de también poner en la mesa, que complementan todo el trabajo increíble a nivel nacional, doméstico, y también al nivel internacional.
Thank you for those thoughts, Pasha. And over to you, Irene. I wonder if you could reflect a bit more about, you made a point about allies and champions, and what does that mean in the context of this queer peace building work, maybe in relation to what the other speakers have shared, but also to elaborate a bit like what that means in the context of queering peace building or queer peace building.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Allies and champions, without which no forward movement would happen. So I'm going to answer your question by way of giving an example of something that I experienced nearly 20 years ago when I first started out in this work. It was my first introduction to peace building in a post-war environment. And so 18 years ago, I was working with a national Afghan community development and peace building NGO that was based in Kabul. It was just a few years after the Taliban had been expelled. The UN Security Council Resolution 1325 had just been passed. We didn't have the humanitarian development triple nexus. That is very common now. We didn't have the mandate of the independent expert on SOGI. We didn't even have UNDP's work on peace and development assistance. So I turn up as a foreigner in Afghanistan, armed with my very amateur and beginner's notions of positive and negative peace. Some of you might be familiar with Johan Galtung. So this was somebody whose work I studied a lot. And the NGO that employed me had asked me to help them implement an initiative that was funded by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which was intended to be both a humanitarian refugee reintegration project and a peace building project. UNHCR was working by itself on this. They were not cooperating with UNDP, the World Bank, the UN political and peacekeeping mission in Afghanistan. And UNHCR's idea at the time was to foster sustainable reconciliation through community-led peace building and micro-scale development projects whose success depended on the willingness of previous enemies to collaborate with each other. So the team that I worked with, which was an entire Afghan team, went to facilitate community-based reconciliation conversations, as well as to help people who had long grievances against each other learn to develop kind of community projects together. And so at that time, my understanding of post-conflict peace building was very much embedded in that liberal peace that you guys have talked about. It was a cis heteronormative liberal peace building framework. At that time, I didn't see how damaging it was to blindly follow that network. And I spent a lot of time visiting poor mountain communities in northern Afghanistan with my Afghan colleagues. And on one of these visits, I was pulled aside by a young man who was about 20 years old. He and his family had just returned from Pakistan, from a refugee camp in Pakistan. And he asked me how he could get help from the UN because he was gay and he didn't know if he would be safe moving to a different part of Afghanistan to a bigger city to find work. He certainly didn't want to come out in his village. And I was not out either at that time. The Afghan NGO I worked for was very conservative. I didn't think they would be a good resource for him. So I asked my counterpart at the UN Refugee Agency for help. They didn't know what to do either. Okay. Because I was in the closet, I didn't know how to reach out to the underground queer Afghan network. In the end, I gave this young man the UNHCR hotline number, but I felt very helpless. And we were both trapped. In fact, we were both trapped by multiple layers of invisibility, personal, familial, societal, structural, and institutional. And unfortunately, I don't know what happened to him. At the UN Security Council ARIA conversation of 2 weeks ago, there was also a queer Afghan human rights defender who spoke. He is leading one of Afghanistan's first formal or more visible LGBTIQ+ human rights alliances currently. And he said that even today, in the year 2023, most of the international organizations in Afghanistan ignore the situation of queer internally displaced people in Afghanistan, which means that 20 years after UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was approved, queer and trans people in conflict-affected areas like Afghanistan still need to fend for themselves. So I'm sharing this example with all of you so that we see what happens when there is no peace building, when there's not a queering of peace building. You can see all the linkages where things are not connecting up, right? And if we kind of look at that again, what would be a more ideal situation? Would be if this young person were to have told me, okay, I feel unsafe because I'm queer. Who can I talk to? Ideally, he would be able to connect either through me or through the Afghan NGO that I would have been working with at the time to a safe network of allies. So that's a civil society network. Ideally, there would be somebody at the UN Refugee Agency that would also either be aware of the same network or have access to resources, be well-trained, be committed to protecting a person in his situation, and would be able to give him more practical advice. If it's not in their mandate to do so, perhaps they could contact another sibling UN agency or the Human Rights Office or a similar organization that could help him, you know, understand what his resources and options were. But even for those things to exist, you know, there needs to be a lot of political will, right? So when you talk about allies and champions, we need to have queer affirming allies and champions in every setting, right? Maybe there would have been an imam in that village with whom he would have felt safe talking to, but if that wasn't going to happen, there would need to be a civil society organization or even a queer network that he could tap into. And where do more structured organizations like NGOs, national or international, or UN, humanitarian or human rights or development or peace building agencies fit into that picture? So I think at each level, work needs to be done and work is happening to transform the cultures of those institutions to first notice that queer people exist and that queer people experience very particular intersecting challenges, vulnerabilities. Sometimes the risks are very dire, partly because the larger organizations don't understand how to categorize them because of their intersectional identities. And I think that's something that is beginning to improve now. I think also staff who are working inside some of those larger, particularly international organizations, can themselves be isolated and marginalized. If they don't have support from executive leadership, then it will be an uphill battle to get LGBTQI plus inclusion mainstreamed into the work of that institution, right? So that's why I think it's important to have that whole of society approach, no matter if you're in the UN or you're a member of your government parliament or you're a civil servant in a government ministry. You know, you can use your leadership and your influence if you're at the community level or you're, you know, in a national LGBTQI plus rights organization. You can also use your influence. If you're an artist, like Pasha mentioned, you can really evoke that imaginary that I think that moves people to really press for change and to make that change when they have the power to do so, so that we don't have to have more people like that 20-year-old man that I met many years ago, that he would be in safer hands. And I think this is where the Colombia example is quite striking and strikingly positively different to what we see in other parts of the world. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And I do think part of what we're wanting to do is to also document that there is this history of, yes, places of exclusion, but also places where people have been in community and have been working on this and in different levels outside the UN as well. But thank you so much for really grounding that and basing it in your own work, which is really, really helpful to be thinking about. I want to hand this our discussion now over to Sam, because they've been monitoring the comment box, and we've got some questions from our audience. So over to you.
Hola, hola a todas, todos, todes. ¿Me oyen? ¿Sí? Can you hear me? Sí, perfecto. Me llamo Samuel Ritholtz, soy un Max Weber Fellow en el Instituto Universitario Europeo y un investigador en el Centro de Estudios Refugiados de la Universidad de Oxford. Voy a hablar en inglés porque es mi idioma nativo, pero antes de hacer eso, un poco de procedimiento. Quiero destacar que vamos a aceptar comentarios y preguntas en el chat, entonces por favor escriben sus comentarios, escriben sus preguntas en cualquier idioma, en inglés, español, y yo voy a intentar de actuar como un moderator por el próximo 15-20 minutos. So hi everyone, my name is Sam Ritholtz. I am a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and a researcher at the Oxford Refugee Study Center. Also a co-editor of the special issue. Thank you so much to our panelists today, to our contributors to the special issue, to UNDP, to Universidad de los Andes, and to all of you for joining us. As Jamie just said, I'm now going to moderate some comments that and questions that were happening in the chat. As this happens, please feel free to continue to add questions, add comments, and hopefully this can be a bit of a lively discussion, excuse me, I'm something in my eye, for the next 15 to 20 minutes. So one of the first things I wanted to point out was a comment that was made by Manuel Antonio Velandia Mora, who says that he was one of the first recognized homosexual victims in the peace process. And Manuel wrote his comment in Spanish, but then I put it in English as well, because I thought it was a really interesting contribution, which was that, and kind of even what I'm doing here is a reflection of it, that as of now in Colombia, it seems that voices of victims have been only heard through very institutionalized passages, whether it's through mediation, through institutions or interlocutors, and even the idea of art in the peace process has been very mediated through institutions. And so the first question that I want to throw out to I'm going to put this question out to the audience, and then I'll put a second question out, which comes from, let me find it. It was from Leah. So this question I first want to ask to our panelists is, what is the role and this tension between institutions and, civil society voices, victims' voices, survivors' voices? And is there something, this is a tension that comes up a lot with social movements, right? What happens when they get co-opted, or what happens when they get incorporated into broader mechanisms of social justice? So I wonder if people could just reflect on Manuel's comments, as well as their own thoughts about this tension between the institution and civil society or survivors. The second one is from Leah, and it's a question to what Pasha has been describing, but I think it works best if we throw it out to all three of the panelists, and we'll do the same order of Mauricio, Pasha, and then Irene, which is, how do we resist the valuable lessons from projects like this getting co-opted, diluted into mainstream, liberal, superficial, peacekeeping building projects? We often see attempts to co-opt queer and feminist politics into the status quo. How do we stop this from happening here? So both these questions really are focusing on this idea of, co-optation and this tension between advocacy that happens outside of certain spaces, and once it gets access to privileged spaces, being very institutionalized. So I'll start with Mauricio, and then again, we'll do Pasha and then Irene.
Yo creo que, bueno, Manuel tiene una observación muy apropiada, y es que es cierto que es en las instituciones, o esto es muy colombiano realmente, pues no muy colombiano, pero realmente es una forma en que nosotros creamos instituciones para todos los problemas, y es a través de las instituciones que creamos unos canales para participar, para comunicarnos, etcétera. Eso tiene algo de bueno en la medida en que establece una comunicación con el Estado, pero tiene algo, y pienso mucho en el plebiscito, porque es como mi trauma de años, y es el plebiscito permitió un encuentro entre un Estado más institucional, es decir, todo el Estado a favor de la paz, y un sector de la sociedad, por las razones que sean, por noticias falsas, por campañas políticas, que dijo no. Y yo creo que ese es un momento que hace falta más pensar. No sé, pienso ahora también en la paz con el ELN. Si se hiciera un plebiscito hoy sobre la paz con el ELN, pues imagínense el resultado. Entonces hay también esa disonancia que plantea Manuel muy interesante, es las instituciones nos escuchan y conectando con lo que decía Pasha, ¿y qué pasa con la sociedad? ¿La sociedad sí está escuchando? ¿La sociedad sí está cambiando? ¿O es reactiva frente a ese proyecto más de paz? Y frente a la cooptación, o sea, yo no voy de pronto o sea, yo no creo que todos los proyectos institucionales, digamos, sean no, o sea, yo creo mucho en la construcción de instituciones y creo que esas instituciones no necesariamente son una imposición liberal o neoliberal, las instituciones también tienen unas historias y unos contextos locales muy interesantes y yo creo que a pesar de que el proyecto, digamos, sea liberal, no creo que necesariamente ese proyecto logre cooptarlo todo y también en nuestros países, pues esos proyectos nosotros siempre los mestizamos, los criollizamos, hacemos otra cosa con esos proyectos, vivimos con ellos a veces en normalidad y a veces en anormalidad. Entonces yo no diría tanto que hay una cooptación, lo que sí hay es como una hibridación entre las prácticas, lo que la gente hace con las instituciones y lo que las instituciones pretenden hacer es como una permanente situación práctica en las instituciones y pienso mucho en los funcionarios que tienen que aplicar estos conceptos en la práctica y las tensiones que tienen con lo que llamamos las víctimas o los otros actores digamos, ni siquiera uno puede llegar a cooptación, ni siquiera hay un momento que es como la vida práctica que los funcionarios no saben cómo hacer algo, que es para mí una cosa muy interesante donde surge la imaginación entre los actores, es cómo hacemos esto que antes no sabíamos cómo hacerlo.
Great. Thank you for that, Mauricio. And then let's now go straight. I want to mindful of time. So contributors, panelists, take your time, but I'm just going to go straight to Pasha.
Voy a ser muy breve y construyendo con Mauricio, creo que para mí el concepto clave es tensión productiva. O sea, hay instituciones, necesitamos trabajar dentro de las estructuras que existen, pero a la vez tenemos apuestas que van más allá de los parámetros de ciertos espacios, ¿no? Entonces hay siempre una tensión productiva, ¿no? Y siempre para mí la respuesta es cómo empujar y estirar esos procesos productivos, en esos procesos, ¿no? Para poder ganar espacio epistémico y ganar espacio conceptual más allá de añadir otro grupito más a la mezcla, ¿no? Como que pues los LGTBI pues se mezcla, pero al final se pega en la última frase, ¿no? Pero cómo es que se puede estirar y cambiar el terreno de la lucha, ¿no? Porque estos espacios son terrenos de lucha, ¿no? Siempre. ¿Cómo podemos repensar, cómo podemos retar la forma en que definimos ese mismo espacio? Y ahí creo que es importante pensar en quién está en el espacio, quién no está y qué podemos hacer para que la gente que normalmente no está en el espacio puede tener voz y voto.
Muchas gracias por eso, Pasha. Y para terminar, vamos a ir con esta ronda de preguntas. Hay más tiempo para otra ronda si gente quieren decir algo más o preguntar algo más, pero ya vamos a salir con Irene. Irene, please.
Oh, thank you, Sam. Well, you raised a really good question. How both of the people in our audience have shared really incisive questions on how to deal with these ongoing tensions between the agendas of large institutions, including the state, and civil society, which is itself a very broad and diverse community as well. How can we resist being co-opted into the more mainstream liberal peace building projects, and thus kind of diluting our effectiveness if we become institutionalized? So this is what I heard from the two questions. And they're very meaningful and personal to me, these two questions, because I've spent most of my life trying to figure out, where I can make my best contribution. Is it to be inside the establishment, or is it to be outside the establishment? And where, what would be the best kind of positionality for myself? But I think this is a question that comes up for each and every person in the room. You'll have your own awareness of your own strengths and the kind of environments you would thrive in most. Some people will likely do better outside these large institutional structures because they can be very dense and they can constrict the kind of change you would want to make, especially if you want to do more deeper transformative work, or you want to have that change happen in at a faster rate. Some people might be more comfortable inside those large institutions if they are willing to work with incremental change, so very small movements over a long period of time, but movements that are likely to last, in a certain sense. As I reflect on these questions, I think it might help us to think about, well, who are we accountable to? In terms of civil society, civil society organizations can have a whole range of goals, missions, and mandates, and but are more likely to be accountable to people they represent than sometimes government institutions, because sometimes government elected officials are accountable to people who vote for them. Okay, and so I think it might be helpful to think about, where are those lines of accountability, and how can we diversify our lines of accountability so that they're not so narrow, right? And I think in order to do that, it might help to reflect on what are the primary motivations of our various projects, whether or not we're in a government office or we're part of a social movement, part of a collective, could be an anarchist collective, it could be a formalized NGO. What is it that actually drives us to imagine this emancipatory peace? How do we see ourselves living in that peace, and our loved ones, and even people that we don't know but would consider to be part of our broader kinship community? So my personal reflection is that if our primary motivation is to secure power, then that is going to make it very difficult in the long run to really be able to actualize that radical imaginary that Pasha mentioned earlier, because that kind of motivation will make the radicalness of that imaginary, it will make it heavier, right? And that's its own form of institutionalization, is the degradation of that energy. And if our motivation were to come from a more compassionate, empathetic place, then I think we would maybe have a bit more support in realizing in a concrete sense those changes that we want to see in society, regardless of whether we're sitting inside a large institution and advancing its neoliberal project, or we are looking to create a completely different economic system, a different socio-ecological balance. And we want to transform kind of the entire foundation of the world that we live in right now. So that is my thought on it.
Okay, great. So we have now a few more questions in the chat. Thank you everyone for your for those contributions and for those additions. There's basically two questions and a comment. What I want to be mindful of is that we're hoping we have about 7 minutes left of this portion. So I want to invite the panelists to, respond to one of the questions or give perhaps a final comment, or if you can squeeze some things in quickly, about just to conclude, final thoughts. To just sum up what's been written in the chat, Emma Pritchard has a question about the tension of using queer as a frame to approach queer peace building, particularly as it's something that is quite positioned at times or comes from a tradition of positioning in the global north. And so how does it translate to different geographies and traditions? And is there a risk of replicating unequal power structures in trying to destabilize them? So panelists, feel free to engage with that. Feel free to send it on to the next one as you wish. Then Elizabeth Duque Wilches has a comment about this tension of, has anyone encountered this tension between the national Sorry, someone muted me. I don't know if that's okay. I'll just keep going. And so has anyone found a tension between the national police or and the civil society in working together to try and articulate this form of peace building? And then interestingly, Manuel has two comments in Spanish in the section now that might be interested for those who want to engage with them, to think about and perhaps engage one-on-one with Manuel. Manuel, no sé si tú quieres poner en tu chat tu email o algo como así para que seguir con este diálogo a partir de este espacio. But Manuel's talking a lot about, these spaces, about being heard, about who gets in the room, but also who's heard. So basically, two comments about queer as a frame, about national police, and then final conclusion, including thoughts from everyone. So we have about 5 minutes, so just briefly, the panelists, and then we'll have Fernando conclude. So starting with Mauricio.
No, brevemente sobre la policía. Este es un campo muy interesante de trabajo en la región, las policías de América Latina, y solamente quisiera decir algo sobre la policía colombiana. La policía colombiana es una institución, y tal vez las últimas declaraciones del comandante del director general de la policía sobre la relación entre la religión y el Estado, sobre el aborto, sobre la relación entre cometer crímenes y su validación en la Biblia, sobre la homosexualidad, sobre el VIH, reflejan un poco el estado de nuestra policía, y es una policía que en su lema dice Dios y patria. Entonces, es unas policías que todavía mantienen unas estructuras totalmente ¿cómo será? Discriminatorias, de exclusión social. Entonces, pues sí, no solo es una tensión, es un problema grandísimo que no hemos podido solucionar.
Great, thank you, Mauricio. And Manuel also is talking about the dynamics now with the General Sanabria and his comments recently, the director of the Policía de Colombia. Let's go to Pasha. I think some of these questions might be very much in your terrain.
I'm going to answer the question about queer peace building from Emma Pritchard. And I'll just say, in my work, I obviously work in and around and through queer theory, but I don't find it to be the most useful in thinking about this kind of work in Latin America and in the Andes in specific. So I don't particularly take up the word Q-U-E-E-R. I do find C-U-I-R or C-U-Y-R to be particularly useful. I do find that useful in the Andes in specific. And the reason why I'm going to cite Diego Falconi, who's written about this in specific about the CUYR, which is queer using the basis of cuir. And cuir is an animal that we would translate in English to guinea pig. And the cuir is a very, very significant, important source of protein in traditional sort of like, highland areas. And to me, the play with that word, it's an animal that is extremely reproductive, and you could say sort of sexual, like always, reproducing. Also, the way that it's cooked is that it's speared from its mouth through its anus, and it's like roasted and turned on a spit, and then placed on your plate and eaten. So there's all these different kinds of like ways in which Falconi works with a particular way of thinking about queer that's anchored in the Highland Andean reference point. And to me, that would be, and you see it in this special issue. I didn't see a place in the special issue that gets deep into why CUIR, but I wanted to offer that as a way of like complicating and sort of rethinking how this lands in different geopolitical spaces.
Thank you so much for that, Pasha. And then any concluding really quick rapid thoughts from you, Irene, before we have Fernando finish us out.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sam. I think I'm going to try to give a shot. I'll try to reflect a little bit on Manuel Antonio Velandia Mora's question. I apologize to everyone in advance. I don't speak Spanish, and so this will be going through translation. So Manuel, you talk about the body as a territory that has become an affront to heteronormative, cisgender, binary, Judeo-Christian society, and that confinement and immobilization are an exercise of biopower, particularly used by security forces, and that if we don't move as political subjects who assert our human and sexual rights, then we will be putting ourselves in danger. I want to kind of close my remarks on that. Yesterday, I was attending another webinar hosted by the Queen Mary University in London School of Law, and they were talking about the use of artificial intelligence in migration management and asylum management. So this is a little bit adjacent to the work of peace building, but where there is armed conflict, there will be displaced people. And what happens when we start to import these technologies of biopolitical control over the lives of people? And the first type of institution that tends to be very interested in acquiring this type of machine learning technology is the security state, right? And so I think when we think about queer peace building, we do need to keep in mind that we are talking about human beings. And I think in our lifetimes, a lot of the processes, the mechanisms that are currently used to understand conflict, to discriminate people into in-groups and out-groups, to continue to marginalize queer people will become automated, which adds a whole nother dimension to some of the challenges and dangers that we need to address. So for me, a truly queer peace would ideally promote that radical imaginary, that really transformative approach to creating a more equitable and inclusive society. But I think in order to do that, we have to be aware of the seductions, all the temptations of making things faster and cheaper and superficially easier. And that's not just in terms of a governmental process, but also a conceptual kind of process in wanting to reduce things into easy categories because it suits us as well as the algorithm. I think if we are able to retain our humanity, then we will not be vulnerable. We will not allow ourselves to be vulnerable to those easy reductions and those algorithmic calculations, miscalculations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. Sorry to rush you at the end there. I'm just conscious of the time. So very quickly, let's have Fernando finish us out.
Muchas gracias de nuevo por sus comentarios, por su participación el día de hoy, no solamente a quienes nos han acompañado en el panel, sino al público que ha estado presente, en especial también a mis colegas que han sido parte de este equipo editorial. Solo quisiera cerrar recordando lo que acabamos de hacer, y es que este es todavía un trabajo en proceso. La razón por la que llamamos nuestro capítulo introductorio un trabajo en marcha es porque precisamente mucho de lo que estamos tocando hoy todavía requiere más desarrollos, requiere más intercambios, no solamente entre contextos culturales, entre países, entre lugares de experticia, sino también una forma diferente de dialogar en nuestras diversidades. Los activismos son diversos, la academia es diversa también, y en los intercambios que hacemos debemos reconocer esa diversidad, pero también las tensiones que hay en las diferentes formas como abordamos estos temas. Y eso fue algo de lo que quisimos hacer en nuestro capítulo introductorio. De nuestra parte, vamos a continuar ahora en el trabajo de traducir parte de estas contribuciones. Queremos, como acabamos de hacer ahora, recordar que la traducción no es solamente un asunto lingüístico, es un asunto altamente político y conflictivo, y precisamente esta idea de cómo traducir conocimientos, experticias, lenguajes, es parte de las cosas con las que tenemos que trabajar, y les invitamos a que precisamente continuemos estas conversaciones. Les invitamos a que se apropien de este número especial, lo usen como herramienta de trabajo, lo usen como material para ser discutido, contestado, cuestionado, porque aún es mucho lo que tenemos que hacer. Solo quisiera entonces cerrar de nuevo agradeciéndole a Pacha, a Mauricio, a Irene por estar en el panel el día de hoy, a mis colegas coeditores de este número, a Sam, a Melanie, a Jamie, por ser parte de esta idea. Agradecer también al equipo de UNDP We Belong Africa por facilitarnos el tema de traducción el día de hoy. Agradecerle al equipo de traductoras que nos ha ayudado, y también al equipo técnico de la Universidad de los Andes, en especial a Andrea Sánchez y a Jimmy Torres, quienes nos han ayudado en toda la parte técnica de este evento. Les invitamos entonces a que consulten el número, y a que si tienen alguna duda, comentario, sugerencia, pues ya saben dónde encontrarnos, y estaremos en mucha disposición a continuar esta conversación que hemos iniciado el día de hoy. Muchas gracias y muy buenos días, muy buenas